Okay. Is on? Good afternoon. We are about to start, so I will be grateful if you could get to your seats, and that way we can get started this event. So thank you very much to all of you for coming to this event on land administration and poverty. We will start with the welcome remarks by Caroline Hayder, Senior VP IG, and then we will have the presentation, a brief presentation on the highlights of the report, Land Administration, IG findings from World Bank project performance assessments, and then we will have the panel discussion. Before starting, then I will invite you all to, if you have your iPhone or your phone or your tablet, I don't see the... Sorry, there is a, I don't see it. There, sorry. In your phone or your tablet, you can go to this site and you can connect to Poly Everywhere, where the rules of the game during the event is that you can ask questions throughout the presentation and during the panel discussion through this site. We will make sure that we will identify the questions that are relevant to the discussion, and if we have time, we can also ask the panelists to answer the questions that will be missing, that could not be discussed during the panelist presentations. And now, if you are in your phone or your tablet, we can do some tests. So first, if you can answer this first question on how relevant is land administration to the work you do. We can see that's very relevant. It keeps on moving a little. But, okay. The next one is about the U.S. presidential election. No, it's about it's to see if you have actually do your homework and you have read the report that will be presented by April here. I guess some people are not sure if they have read it. Okay, well, you are here to learn about the report, and I'm sure that after April's presentation, you're going to go back to the office and print it out and read it this afternoon. It's a very, very interesting and very valuable report. So, before April, then we will invite Caroline to give some introductory remarks. Thank you much.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody. Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to open this seminar on land administration and poverty reduction. And I wanted to start out actually sharing with you a story, my own experience. I was doing an evaluation in Southeast Asia, and we visited poor villages and, among others, talked to very poor farmers. At the time I was working for the Asian Development Bank, and we had financed an irrigation project. And so obviously we wanted to know, were the farmers participating in the irrigation management sort of thing, and whatever, you know, were their voices heard? Were they benefiting from the water? And this very poor farmer was very thoughtful. And he said, my land is so far away, I have to walk there 2 hours, and I have to walk there 2 hours back. So I don't have much time to spare. The land is very poor, It's Sweden agriculture, so it hasn't gotten very rich soil. And so I have to work very hard to produce just enough food to feed my family. And so there is no time to either be on a committee or, take up work, employment opportunities that might occur as a result of, having irrigation now in the village, because overall I need to first of all feed my family. Today, this was many years ago, I would say 15 years ago, 98 actually, to be precise. I'm pretty sure that his land is now used as a farm a rubber plantation, where a neighboring country would have come in to get a license, legal or illegal, to eliminate those farms and grow rubber. So this is all to say how important land titling is for rural people. It gives them the right to and ownership of land. It can be used as a collateral, and it really can give them greater security to work their way out of poverty. And so with this in mind, we had a look at what the World Bank has been doing in terms of improving land administration, land titling, in order to help people get more access to a resource that is extremely important for them. The second thing that's really important about this particular event, it is less about the report. In IEG, we have committed to improving our learning side. Evaluation is always about accountability and learning. And over the last couple of years, we've invested in sort of thinking about what are some of the lessons that need to be learned, some of the lessons and messages that the operational colleagues you need in order to do a better job and make the World Bank Group more successful. So these are shorter reports. They're based on IEG evidence, but more importantly, they involve a conversation like the one today. And in the future, we want to expand on this model and make it even more interactive and more learning focused, so that whatever we come up with is not just a nice and good looking report, but that it is learning that gets internalized so that the World Bank Group can deliver better for the people it serves, so that, for example, farmers like the one I have met years ago can actually sort of be sure to have land that he cannot be just expelled from, or at least be compensated for when he loses it. So with that, we'll have a presentation by April, who has done the synthesis of these project evaluation reports, and actually one of the authors of the PPARs. John is actually just arrived and joined us as well. So thank you very much for coming. April, over to you.
Okay, good afternoon. Now, the purpose of this event today is to have a conversation, not only with our land tenure experts, but also with those of you who are experts in other areas, but whose work is impacted by land issues. And to catalyze that discussion, I'm not going to cover every aspect of IEG's report. Instead, I'm going to talk about select findings that, taken together, highlight some institutional tensions that the World Bank Group needs to navigate in order to more effectively address land administration issues and generate the broader development impacts to which land issues are often a critical bottleneck. And then I'm going to close by posing some questions related to these tensions, and I'll ask you to reflect on those along with other issues that the rest of our panelists are going to raise. So these findings come from a recent IEG learning product, and this product aimed to surface cross-cutting lessons and findings that emerged in IEG project performance assessments of individual land operations. So the first thing that struck me in carrying out this task was that land issues and land projects are not all the same. And that's linked to the incredible diversity of implementation context. So as you can see here, the projects that we reviewed were carried out in countries that have got distinct historical, political, and social contexts. The land tenure traditions in these countries varied. The pre-existing land administrations vary, as well as the constraints affecting the effectiveness of these land administration systems. And that has implications both for what the underlying land issue is, as well as the country's institutional capacity to handle these challenges. So to illustrate that, consider, for example, the projects that we looked at in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Here, the projects were carried out at a time when the countries were moving towards market-based economies, and the land reforms that these projects supported were closely linked to a privatization agenda. In many cases, the countries had greater institutional capacity than what was available in some of the other countries that we reviewed. So contrast that with the projects that we looked at in Central America. Here we were looking at projects that were carried out in El Salvador and Guatemala at a time when those countries had recently emerged from years of armed conflict. So we were looking at a post-conflict implementation context. The social context was still divided. The countries were in a poor fiscal constraint. And as a consequence, they had relatively lesser institutional capacity to handle these challenges. Contrast that experience with Africa. Here we looked at a project in Ghana, which had an additional complexity. Now, every other project that we looked at was primarily focused on improving systems to secure statutory tenure. In the case of Ghana, they were attempting to harmonize both customary tenure and statutory tenure, both of which are guaranteed by the Constitution, but had significant political economy issues behind them. So given this diverse implementation context, it may not be surprising to find that we found there were few universal best practice solutions. This is a sector where the lessons are extremely context specific. But one thing that was universal across projects is that land issues are complex. So what these projects are trying to do is not simply title land. They're trying to develop an institutional system, a governance system that's actually providing land rights in a way that's socially acceptable. They're upgrading outdated land laws to ensure that documentation to property rights is backed by legal systems. They're upgrading the institutional capacity to address all of this. It's also a sector where there's significant vested interest and political economy dimensions, which adds to that complexity. So what we found is that given that complexity, land issues are best tackled through standalone land operations as opposed to components of multi-sectoral projects. Now, I'll give you some historical context to this finding. When the bank first began addressing land tenure through projects decades ago, they did so as components of broader rural development projects. And the results of that early experience were not good. So when reviews were carried out to take a deeper look at what had happened, what they found was across the board, the land component was the worst performing part of the projects, that the complexity of the issues as well as the cost of dealing with them had been grossly underestimated. And they also found that when land is not the primary focus of an operation, important institutional dimensions of land administration were overlooked. So the projects that I reviewed took into account the learning from this early experience. And that's one of the reasons why most of the projects that we reviewed were in fact designed as standalone land operations. But what we saw is that even looking across the standalone operations, projects tended to do better when they were designed and structured in a way that allowed them to incrementally tackle this complexity. So they were incrementally addressing updating land legislation, making upgrades to the land administration infrastructure, and upgrading the existing human resources capacity incrementally over time. So we also saw that many of these projects were one phase of a longer phase land program, which reflects another reality, and that is that putting in place an effective land administration system is something that takes medium to long-term support. So the first part of the tension that I mentioned initially is that the lesson for individual projects seems to be we need to design these in a way where we're providing concentrated support, but we're also taking care not to overload a single operation. A single land operation, as I mentioned, will make incremental improvements to a longer-term process. So we need to take care to set project expectations based on what's realistic for an individual project to achieve within a specific project period. Now, the second part of this tension is that while land issues are fundamental and oftentimes a critical bottleneck to broader development challenges, addressing land alone is not always going to get you to these broader development outcomes that the World Bank and our client countries are trying to achieve. So agriculture productivity is not going to increase just because a farmer has secure and clear rights to the plot of land that he's farming. We know that farmers also need appropriate access to inputs and output markets. By the same token, in housing finance, an effective land registry system that's contributing to security and clarity and transferability of land rights can be an important part of the enabling environment for mortgage markets. But mortgage markets do not thrive simply because you have an effective land registry system. So what you also see is that reforms are often needed in other sectors beyond the reach of a land project. And oftentimes, these reforms in other sectors can be challenging in their own right. So what we saw in that circumstance is that parallel operations are often better than a single project that tries to do everything. So given what I've just said, the questions I'd like to leave you with are within the World Bank Group's new structure. What can we do to make sure that we're providing sufficient resources, attention, and space to our land tenure colleagues to allow them to get a handle and make traction on these very complicated long-term land issues, but at the same time, make sure that they're not carried out in isolation and that we've got a concerted approach to making sure that they're appropriately coordinated and sequenced with reforms that need to happen in other areas that are managed by other global practices. So I'll leave you with that and hand it over to Enrique and our panelists.
Thank you, April. Before we start, then I would like to introduce our distinguished panelists. And on my right, we have Klaus Denninger, lead economist in the Agriculture and Rural Development at DEC. And next to him, we have Paola Agostini. She's lead environmental specialist, global lead, I believe, in the environment and natural resource global practice. Then we have Mark Constantine, principal strategist, environmental and social risk management, Mass Department at IFC. And then we have, at the very end, we have Preeti Ahuja. She is practice manager for the global agricultural practice. Then we have Jorge Munoz. He's practice manager for the global Land and Geospatial Unit. And then next to him, we have Beatrix Alamensa, senior country officer at the World Bank field office in Ghana. It's a pleasure to have you all here. And before we start, then just a few rules of the game. I'm going to ask some questions to the panelists, and you will have about 5 minutes to answer. Then at the same time, colleagues here in the audience, you can send your questions to the poll everywhere that if you can connect to that site. And then we will take the questions into the discussion, or if we have time to, we'll ask the panelists to answer them at the very end. So we will start with the first question for Beatrix. And starting with the report that April just presented, which draws specific lessons based on the review for these land administration projects, it will be very helpful for us to know if there are similar issues that you see currently happening on the ground, and how are these issues actually playing out in Ghana, for example.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I would respond to your question from 3 points. Yes, the issues that April raised in her presentation, and indeed in the report, play out quite significantly in Ghana. I must say that there has been some changes, and I'll talk about that. My first point is that having an institutional structure does not guarantee an effective coordination of functions. This is one of the lessons from the review. The question I want to throw out is, what is the alternative to this situation? Of course, coordination should not, be limited to the existence of institutional structure. But if you take an environment like Ghana under the LAP project that we had a couple of years back, this is a situation where the project implementation team had to come against 6 different land sector agencies, 6 development partners, each of which was implementing just an aspect of the project activities. They also had to come against different traditional customary land ownership systems within a legal framework that was very chaotic, different laws not talking to each other, some even competing with each themselves. So within this scenario, we have the significant effect of how to manage these challenges. And so for us in Ghana, the merging of the 6 land sector agencies into 4 LSAs was an important first step. And we recognize that although at the end of the project, the coordination was not achieved as expected, I'm happy to say that under the follow-on project, the Land Administration Project 2, the coordination is taking place. And I think the point raised on this in the review is specifically played out in the Slovenia and the Bulgaria cases. My second point is on project design. Should project design be made to fit existing legal, institutional, and technical capacity? I'm sure most of us would answer yes to that. And this indeed is an important lesson. But in the Ghana scenario, we realize that the existing legal, institutional, and technical capacity were indeed part of the challenge for which the project was designed. So it would be important to consider a balance of project design, which considers a situation where you can have an upgrade and enhancement as systems become improved, as capacities become enhanced. The project should take this into consideration so that at the end of the day, you are not repeating the challenges that the project was expected to address, but you see positive change in land administration within the sector. The third point that I want to raise is the issue of realism and readiness. Was the project ready? Was it realistic? And I'm looking at it from the perspective of the scope, the project development objective and the targets, and of course, an appropriate sequencing of project activities are all very important. Within the Ghanaian context, what the project sought to do was more or less to respond to a national land policy that has been approved a couple of years back. So everything was put in the project as a response to the land policy, and that was a serious challenge as far as realism was concerned. Now, for this to be effectively championed, I think that we will need an assurance of long-term funding commitment within a very robust monitoring and evaluation system, an understanding of the impact of political economy, both at the national and the sub-national levels. And the political elites should also have a clear understanding of the technical implications and requirements for such implementation of such complex projects. If we are able to bring the political elites on board, we will be able to address, in large part, some of the challenges that I have, mentioned. Because in the Ghana situation, where you have frequency in change of ministers, the leadership was very important. The commitment from political leadership was a crucial part of project implementation. And that was a struggle from the beginning. So I believe that putting the points that I've raised together we should be able to have or achieve the envisioned land administration system that is efficient, that is effective, that will be fair, and deliver the services that are required by the client. And of course, linking up with other sectors, I believe we'll be able to achieve, important development outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrix. Now, going from the specific case of Ghana, we will ask Jorge to give us now his views on the most important issues related to land administration today at the global level, and also what are we hearing from our external clients and also from our internal clients, our colleagues within the bank.
Thanks very much, Enrique. And first of all, thanks very much to IEG, Caroline, Nadia, April for the opportunity to have this discussion. It's very revealing that having looked at an overview of 14 projects in the course of a decade and a half, a couple of things that come to mind immediately of how things have changed is you may notice in the report there were a couple of issues, 2 or 3 issues that were at the core of how the analysis was framed. One of the issue of the single agency, between the dilemma between registries and cadasters. The second one had to do with how exactly do you affect and measure tenure security, and third, the issue of social inclusion. Well, one of the things we've learned over time that is changing today is that the issue of single agency, it's not that it's gone away, but it is so largely driven by what a particular country decides to do that it's no longer an issue of, oh, let's design this project this way or that way, because the legal institutional framework may already be decided. Secondly, something I've noticed in my current job as overseeing the global unit is a huge difference between the projects mostly in Eastern Europe and to some extent in East Asia, where the challenge was to document, to register pieces of paper that already existed. One of the legacies of the former Soviet bloc is that they kept very good records. So modernizing records basically meant digitizing pieces of paper that now you can put them in a modern system. If you try to do that in Latin America or Africa, there aren't that many pieces of paper to register. So you actually have to go to the field and regularize and adjudicate rights and resolve conflicts. And therefore, the challenges were dramatically different. And we were doing these 2 approaches at the same time. And part of the handicap of the previous structure we had is that these teams were not necessarily aware of the details of how we were all working, presumably under the same objective of securing tenure, increased tenure security, but by very different means. Third, the issue of social inclusion, now it's taken a different context. Now we talk about citizens engagement. We talk about transparency and governance, which land and land administration institutions have become fundamental pillars for allowing governments to be more transparent, facilitating access to their citizens to extremely important information. Now, going back to the issue of what am I hearing now today, obviously, a few things have changed over the last 6 to 8 years. We had the triple F crisis, the food security, the fuel, and then financial crisis, which dramatically changed the way people see government institutions in charge of ensuring security, financial, food, as well as natural resources. Climate change. That has also dramatically changed the importance of land as the single most important natural asset around which everything else is built on. It's either whether it's water or trees or fisheries. Land is at the center of this. We also have noticed an important shift in the last 4 or 5 years in the global understanding and appreciation of the issue, partly as a result of the endorsement of the voluntary guidelines on the governance of tenure, which is an agreement by most governments of the world under the auspices of FAO to tackle land governance issues through a similar umbrella framework. And third, something that continues to change is technology. Today, with geospatial technologies, you're able to do a lot more things faster, cheaper, more securely, and more accessible to the public than even 10 years ago. And this is allowing a lot of new projects to be able to tackle the challenges in a different way. And last, the kinds of things I'm hearing from my internal constituents within the bank is, despite one of the main lessons that April mentioned, that land governance projects are better tackled through standalone projects, I'm still hearing a lot of demands for land components. There's a sector X or sector Y that has a major development challenge, but oops, they run into a land problem and they want to fix the land problem in order to address the sector problem, which is fine as long as that is done in a systematic approach that really takes the bull by the horns. And most of the time, we don't do that. We just did a deep dive in Africa where we looked at all the interventions we're doing now. And unfortunately, we're doing too little, too late, too scattered, too chaotic, too unstrategic, not necessarily tackling what is the fundamental issue. So to conclude, I would say that our clients are asking us for global knowledge. They want to know how. Show me how to tackle this. I spent a couple of trips to Colombia, which I think are listening to us in this presentation. And the big ask we're getting from them is, show me how can we do systematic, large-scale recognition of rights. In their case, it's restitution of people who were displaced. And again, they just passed a major piece of legislative work which already establishes the institutional setup. So there is no question of single agency or double agency because they've already decided that. And the challenge is how you make it happen. And what they ask is show me how to do it. And last but not least, internally, we're doing too little and not enough given the scale of the challenge that the global landscape requires today. So we need to do a lot more, and we need a lot more resources globally, not just within the bank, to tackle this. Thanks, Enrique.
Thank you, Jorge. Before we go to the other panelists, I just wanted to bring in an important point raised by one of the colleagues in the audience, which relates to the package of support that the bank provides. And since April's report was mostly on investment lending, then the question is, and considering all these institutional and legal changes that are required, the issue of why not also do or combine with our development policy lending at the same time, with technical assistance, and what is the trends today and how you see this, particularly in Colombia, where I think there is a similar approach to that. In 1 minute, please.
Thank you. The question of what is the package of services or things the bank has to offer really depends on the country. There are a lot of countries that want basic legal and policy advice that do not necessarily require investments through operations. And other countries where it's the other way around. The policy framework is already there, and it becomes a question of how and a question of financing. They need the resources to do it. In most cases, there's a significant rolling up of the sleeves that needs to be done because tackling actual institutional reforms is very, very complicated, as Beatrix pointed out in the case of Ghana. Setting up sophisticated ICT systems is extremely complex, and there's no guarantee that they will work, no matter how sophisticated they are. Fourth, I would say there's a considerable need for what Caroline mentioned, or I think it was April, the incremental learning approach, the learning by doing. There are certain things that you have to try them in order to learn. For example, quality controls of land surveying and regularization efforts in the field. You don't always know exactly what is it that you're going to find in the field. It's only after you've reviewed the data and information and you talk to people that you realize you have to review some of these things. So these are some of the packages of services and activities that are typically incorporated as part of a project.
Thank you. Now we will ask Priti and Klaus. This relates to the impact of land administration interventions on specific sectors. Any kind of findings, and also how you see the interrelation between these land administration interventions and the sectors you are familiar with.
Okay, so let me start off. As discussed with Klaus, I'll try to address some of the issues first. So, as I was starting to think about this event late last night, I started scouring around looking for data on, projects in the agriculture and food sectors where land is, featured prominently. And I came up sort of empty. There isn't a comprehensive database which can tell me how many projects there are which either tackle the issue in a standalone manner or which include components. So, I can't tell you 50% of our projects in this area have been successful or something of that sort. What I can tell you is that we've been engaged in this field for as long as the bank has been in existence, pretty much. So we have almost half a century of engagement in this area. It's really something which is integral to our projects in agriculture. So integral that perhaps we haven't paid systematic, explicit attention to the various dimensions. And some of the I'll use the word traditional, which comes to mind, foci have been around, productivity, usage, security of tenure so that people can either invest in the land or access, credit where the financial sector so permits, etc. But the new generation of challenges, which is going to be upon us or is already upon us, is something that we need to start thinking about now. But before I get into that, a number of aspects have already been touched on by colleagues. It goes without repeating that these are extremely complex interventions. When I was thinking about this, I was thinking these are such fraught, charged, and complex interventions. You almost think of a long-term marriage. That's what this is like. So, how to get your arms around these issues? First, long-term commitment has been mentioned. We really need to stay the course. These are not one-off projects. These are not things that can be resolved in 5 years. Long-term commitment and monitoring the variations in commitment from the policymakers, from the technical cadres, is absolutely critical. Having institutions, Beatrix talked about, how it takes decades to get the institutional framework right. So it's, the coordination, it's the capacity, it's the commitment, all those dimensions of institutions, national versus subnational institutions, formal versus informal institutions, the role of NGOs, civil society. Jorge talked about citizen engagement, how important it is in this arena to have participatory approaches which are transparent, inclusive, regular, and close the feedback loop. So, you just don't go out and consult with people once, but really keep engaged with them from the design stage through to implementation. the need for consistently monitoring and perhaps even including what we do a lot in the program for results type of projects, but perhaps would be useful here, the independent verification mechanism, bringing in external sort of peer reviewers to assess where we are at, whether the needle has actually moved in the right direction. The other piece that I think that bears repeating is that reforms in this area, tenure security, transferability, etc., land administration improvements are very necessary, but they are not sufficient. So in agriculture, what comes next is also absolutely critical, whether it's inputs, whether it's finance, whether it's know-how. So it's a whole bundle of services that we need to think about in terms of really making these reforms pay off and sustain. Now, I also want to make one last point. I think we have a better understanding of land issues in as much as they pertain to smallholders than we do in terms of how these impact on large commercial estates or even the communal aspects. Those are perhaps even more difficult and more sensitive to get our arms around. And let me just finish off by saying that we really need, as an institution, to think about how to get a systematic evidence base. There's a wealth of information out there. The bank has been the largest financier. We have about 120 projects altogether in this area in agriculture. But how do we draw out, synthesize, and have at our fingertips both the lessons learned as well as the outcomes and the risks that were faced, and how are these addressed? So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we go to Klaus, but at the same time that you can address this general question, there is a very interesting question that I think you could help answer, given your expertise as the sort of brain power of the land administration at the bank. There is a question about why are there so few evaluations focused on the impact, meaning productivity, welfare of land reforms. Is there are a few, or because I've seen a lot of studies published, so...
Okay, now let me first say, if we want to look at impacts, we need to be clear what we are expecting, and I think there are three elements that are absolutely critical. One is at the household level. We want to see, as a result of land interventions, that people are more secure, and I think in that case particularly women, because there's an important gender aspect, and that as a result of that they make more investments, their productivity goes up, they improve, they participate more in land markets and possibly get access to credit. Second, I think economy-wide, we want to see that either bank lending credit to the agricultural or also into the non-agricultural sector goes up, that potentially tax revenue goes up, and that disputes are being reduced, that is in the courts. And I think the third element would be that local capacity is strengthened, because I think we have heard quite a bit about the institutional aspects of that. And I think with local institutional capacity, I would mean not only government, but also academic institutions and think tanks within countries. So looking at, and if we're clear on that, I think the question is, where do we have the evidence that actually supports that? And clearly, I think, and it comes out a little bit in the report, it's not very clear that there has been a systematic review, systematic collection of the evidence in bank projects. I think actually the last systematic impact evaluation that was done of a bank project was of the Thailand project, which I think is long gone. So I think let me give you briefly an example from Rwanda, where DFID in this this case has been implementing another land administration project that has actually achieved quite significant impacts in each of these dimensions, and which we have been documenting in terms of women's empowerment. And we saw very clear, even of the pilot that was undertaken. And I think one of the key issues there, which I think has also lessons for land administration projects, is that they spent 3 years piloting, and then in 3 years after that actually covered the whole country with 11.5 million certificates. So I think that speaks a little bit to what Jorge said, but I think it was essential. And in these pilots, they only did 12,000 parcels, so very limited, but they had a very rigorous impact evaluation. What we found in that impact evaluation is that on the one hand, it was particularly female-headed households whose investment went up disproportionately. But we also found that on average, that people had greater security of tenure or greater documented rights, but that was actually negative for women who were not legally married. And women who are not legally married in Rwanda was about 45% of the population of the married people. So I think we dug into that in a little bit more detail, and we found out that that was a flaw in the regulations, which then the government corrected before they actually rolled out. And I think that this was very important. I think in terms of economy-wide aspects, a key element that the project actually put into place, and I think which is something there where we can have a lot of lessons, is that in land administration you generate reams of data. And in many cases, these reams of data are not very well utilized and organized for actually be available to decision makers on an ongoing basis. Because clearly, I think so what we see in Rwanda, and the project there established a performance monitoring system that is being updated on a monthly basis, where we see very clearly what are the subsequent registrations, what is the market activity, and what are also the indirect impacts, because then I think they linked it up, of course, with the mortgage registry as well as with the tax registry. And what we see, the good news is that we see both potential tax revenues going up by 5.2 million per year, which compared to a project cost of about 45 million means that in less than 2 years you can just from the tax revenue that is generated finance the whole project. We also found that surprisingly for me, there was 2.6 billion of mortgage lending, and out of that, even 500 million to the backed by agricultural land, because of course we don't know what people are using that, but we see what is there. And I think the third one also we see, I think so clearly there are some significant positive impacts. What we also saw, and I think that again speaks to many of the bank land projects, is that subsequent registrations varied a lot between Kigali, where I think there was no problem, and the rural areas where people really hadn't thought very clearly how to ensure the sustainability and how to make sure that people register subsequent transactions. And I think in Rwanda, the level of transactions is actually very high. It's almost 6% per year. So clearly that means unless attention is being paid to that, the system is soon outdated. But of course, we then looked into that in more detail, and it's very clear, or one of the key issues is that the registration fee is flat for the whole country, which of course is very regressive and disadvantages the poor. For some parcels, there is, I think the average cost of registration is about 25% of parcel values for rural parcels. And of course, that is way too high. So I think that is something which we are discussing with the government now, and where I think a follow-up in terms of policy conditionality could also help to actually push that a little bit. But then let me just conclude by saying, okay, look, what are the lessons that I draw from the Rwanda study? I think the first one is that people were very clear upfront what they wanted to get out of it. And there was continued monitoring, not only from the bank, but also in the country. I think I remember that the president on a regular basis was asking what is happening to the project. And I think the outcome indicators were defined very clearly. And of course, there was local capacity built in terms of actually monitoring that, which as a result of that, I think it's both the land administration institution is now providing IT assistance to other other government departments, but also you have local universities actually helping to analyze and to help the government take the next steps in terms of taking this forward.
Thank you, Klaus. In April's mentioned that, and this is now we go to Paola and Mark, that initially land issues were tackled in projects through specific components. Then we have this generation of land projects where where they were specifically for the land sector and dealing with land administration issues. And now we see a trend where more and more land issues are tackled multi-sectorally. So from your perspectives, it will be very good to know what are the key or burning issues that you see in this approach that is emerging now from the multi-sectoral perspective from your sector, and also how you see these land issues tackled better within your own sector.
Okay, we did not coordinate before. Okay, thank you very much. To all the organizers, I think this is an extremely important topic. Let me just explain a little bit where I come from. I'm right now the global lead for landscape, and landscape management, landscape resilience really touches upon many different sectors. In fact, it's what we are interested in when we're talking about sustainable landscape is looking at different land uses, from the agricultural land use to forest land use to pastoral system to land degradation, etc., and see how you can make the landscape more productive, more sustainable, and more resilient. So with that, it is coming out very clearly that if we want to invest in more sustainable landscape, land tenure is a key factor, and it's not surprising. Now, what I would like to challenge all of you on is saying, is that a necessary condition? Is it a sufficient condition? And I would argue that it's neither necessary nor sufficient. In the sense, you can have a best, perfect, whatever, land registration system everywhere, and maybe still having very unsustainable landscape investments, driven by very short-term vision of and profit and short-term interest, or at the same time you can have is it necessary? No, I actually am a very optimistic person, so I think that even in absence of for sure land tenure. But maybe you can have you need to have some limited land security, of course, but you can still invest even when you don't have cases of very clear land rights. You can still invest in your landscape to make them more sustainable in the future. And I'm going to give you a few examples. I was a peer reviewer for a journal a few weeks ago in Sudan, for a very interesting econometric analysis, and here we have our friend on. So there are a few studies through impact studies, was looking at the productivity in a certain region of Sudan, and how it would, and it had many different explanatory variables, and was interesting. 10 years of collection of studies, etc. So. Of course, land tenure came out as a very significant explanatory variable for the investment in more sustainable land system, particularly where we're looking at tree crops, adding tree crops or having only cash crops in your land. And but having said that, at the end, it is a very important variable, but you can still see that people in certain parts of the regions, they were investing in trees, especially where maybe you can let natural regeneration occurring, where you don't have any huge cost in investing in having your landscape more sustainable. The same results I was reviewing for Pro4 in major studies on tree crops everywhere in the world, And even if land tenure comes as an important factor, you can still see that in many parts of the world, people are investing in having trees on their land, helping to manage the land in a more sustainable way, because it can really help the diversification of their income. It can help the resilience against climate variability. It can have different values that they can still do it even if they don't have the security. What I have seen in these 20 years, though, is, and I'm actually very happy that some of the conclusions of the reports are going in the same direction, is that adding to a landscape project a component on land administration, it's way too complex. So my advice when we discuss projects with the different ETL is absolutely it's an important element, but let's try to have it as a standalone project. And what we talk a lot now about when we talk about landscape management is that we are looking at programmatic approaches where you don't necessarily need to put everything under one single Christmas tree project, but you have a programmatic approach. So it's like a puzzle. You have a project that deals with the land issues, another which deals with maybe the agriculture, another one with the connectivity between the forest and the agricultural land. All together, they build the case of a really a better managed landscape. So that's what I would say that is very important. With that, I think that there are a lot of things that when in absence of a clear land tenure, we can still do, because I mean land tenure is your all expert takes maybe 10 years, maybe more. So it's not that we should stop our intervention. We can continue an intervention and think about other ways to stimulate the farmers to actually invest in their landscape. For example, wherever it's possible in Latin America, we have a lot of experience. I was with TTL many years ago for a silvopastoral project working in 3 countries where they used payment of ecosystem services. And even in absence of the land tenure, they had clear enough land rights that you can easily pay either to the individual or to the community level for that. They have similar example in Ghana where Beatrix has worked on it. I remember many years ago in projects where you can promote this kind of more sustainable landscape investment with some incentives, even in uncertainty of tree tenure versus land tenure, etc., and maybe find some schemes where you divide the incentive according to a part to the community, a part to the owner of the tree, a part to the person who is taking charge of a tree. And I also want to mention that when you have very difficult situation, like I see here Gerardo and Sergey that are experts on Liberia that have been working with me for many years on Liberia now. In Liberia, you had a very difficult situation of land tenure and land rights. And what has been extremely important was the role of the NGOs to really help as the government, the private sector, not to make major mistakes. So what I'm trying to say is that try to have in your projects an alliance with some major NGOs. Some of them are even watchdogs. Some of them might be difficult, but at the end of the day, they really help in making sure that the rights of the communities are heard and that we, the big private sector company don't just come and convert all the forest to palm or having major forest concessions. So I think it's another thing that we can do is to empower the community through aligning them with some key NGOs that can be really helping, can help in this. And the other things that I think it's important that we can do is work on conflict resolution mechanism in our projects, in all the projects that we had. There are a lot of conflicts related to land. Even if we cannot solve the land issues right away, if we can come to agreed and negotiated solution, that's already quite important to clarify the situation. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Mark.
Thank you. So I'm in the enviable position of closing this first round and getting to your questions. So I'll try to keep it succinct. I'm as the lone representative from IFC. I'm going to take it, kind of slice this in two different ways. And firstly, I should preface this by saying it's enormously important, the work that IEG has tackled here, and I would say, keep it coming in terms of really particularly this area of cross-sectoral interrelationships, because that is really the key that unlocks this door. And so the two angles I want to take are, one, risk, what happens when you don't get it right, and therefore why you should get it right, try to get it right. And the second is to focus on process more than substance. And some of the panelists have already alluded to this. In terms of risk, so if you look at our compliance advisor, ombudsman, our internal accountability mechanism, an overwhelming share of their cases, their caseload, which comes from communities who complain, in case some of you don't know, they complain about an IFC project from an environmental and social standpoint. If you look at where that caseload originates, overwhelmingly in places like Central America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Make the linkage, I don't have to, uncertain land tenure, issues of inequalities of access to land, of ownership, very much those are ground zero locations, so it's not a coincidence. The second point I guess I'd make, and kind of looking at this more from a bottom-up standpoint, because IFC is involved in individual transactions. So the work that the bank does on the land administration level is enormously important when it either has not been successful, and that's not a blame game, it's simply saying for one reason or another, there hasn't, really been a dream outcome, and everything's orderly and so on. You get this very uncertain boundary of what is the responsibility of the private client versus what is the responsibility of government. And the expectation often is that the private company is going to take the place of the governance gap, and that is simply not possible much of the time. And so this is where we run into a lot of problems. Linkages, the fact that you cannot separate. My colleague Diana, who's in the back of the room, and I are working sort of neck deep, maybe over our heads, in a particular case right now in Honduras, and maybe it's an extreme case because we all know the issues in Honduras, but you simply cannot separate the fact of lack of prosecution, impunity of crimes against other people from the uncertain land tenure situation, from the fact that there's deep-seated resentments that actually go back to a land reform, I should say, supported by the bank back in the early 90s, that made it possible with good intentions for private landowners to assemble larger blocks of land, because the previous experiment, which was basically a cooperative model, was simply not working. Unfortunately, the kids, now a generation later, of mom and dad who sold the land, sometimes under duress, maybe other times not, are coming back, and what you have is a land conflict. And our client, Denant, in this case, is at the center of that conflict. It is not all the company's fault. It's partially their fault because of the way they've handled it, because of lack of well-trained security forces. People have died on both sides. And so this is not joking around, and that sort of segues into the process point I want to make. and that is that as a part of our remedial efforts to try to bring peace to the Bajo Aguan in Honduras, we have engaged a dispute resolution expert who has A, done a participatory stakeholder mapping exercise, and B, then is now involved in something where we're actually trying to create dialogue spaces around land, around impunity, around socioeconomic development, the future socioeconomic development of the area. And all those things you simply cannot separate. They have to be bound together at the top. But I fully agree with what others have said and what IEG's finding, that having said that, you then need to deal with them in a sort of incremental or segmented way, but you never lose sight of the connectivity up here. And that's where you get into the political economy, and that's where you basically create space for dialogue, because you're able to, you can't talk about land tenure, okay, with a bunch of campesinos who think their land was stolen from them, and that the only solution they see at the moment is land redistribution, okay, which is kind of over my dead body to the guys who already have land, literally and figuratively. And so, but on the other hand, if you start talking about a better economic future for these people, and the fact that they will, in their small plots, large plots, be more productive, get access to finance, access to technical assistance, whatever it is, then you start to create, I see, at least you get a separation from the pure political hotheads and the ones who actually care about future livelihoods. So I could ramble on, but I'll stop there and get to the audience questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And actually, no, this is a very important point. And just to bring in some of the questions from the audience, they were important questions, given that we have said that land administration projects are very complex. They require a long-term commitment, obviously commitment from the governments, from the bank and other development partners. So one of the issues is about understanding the political economy of all these changes that are needed. And the question was about if we have adequate instruments to understand the political economy of change required for the land sector. And we know that many sectors are quite complex, but the land administration specifically is really a major challenge in ensuring that we understand all these issues. So perhaps Klaus and Jorge, given your long engagement in land administration projects, could give us an idea of the understanding of the political economy, and if we have thought about some ways of understanding this better.
I think, of course, that is a key issue. And because in many cases, what you do is that, you get into very, very deep-seated political economy issues once you address land tenure. And because it is also, we need to think about that in a very careful way. I think, I probably don't have the time to go into all of the details in terms of specific situations, but I think one issue that is very important and which I think can be used to address the political economy issues, and that links to one of the questions that came up here, is the doing business. Because I've not seen, even of the most corrupt elites, all of them care about how their country fares in doing business. And every time I see them pushing for, and so I think if we can make the link between improving in doing business and improving the transparency of land administration and the way in which land issues are actually monitored on a continuing basis, I think we have a major victory, because then I think we don't have to fight the battle in every country way after and after, country and country by country. And in that case, in that context, I wanted to give credit to the doing business team. I think they have been doing a fantastic job over the last years based on discussions that we had with them about the doing business indicator being too narrow and not taking into account the complexity of land tenure. I think they have now, that indicator is now considering explicitly the quality of land administration, which is the reliability, the coverage, which I think, and coverage is key if we talk about indigenous groups and disadvantaged people, as well as the gender aspects. And we very much hope that we can build on national monitor, we can actually push that down to national monitoring systems. And I think that will be the next push, where I think right now we have indicators on what, whether the country or the main city is mapped and registered. I think we want to have concrete figures and see how these figures are changing over time. And if we have that, I think we can have a major instrument, because yes, I think there may be resistance, but in the end, I think it's all about, our political economy is about increasing the pie and also having the ammunition to show that even some of these elites may be gaining in the long term by having the country having a more transparent system. And I think using the doing business indicator, we can actually do a lot, especially if we link it to country reporting systems.
Thanks, Enrique. Let me mention a couple of examples that is also tied to one of the questions. Lemi, where are the best successful examples? And I'll relate these to political economy. So if we're talking about, for example, facilitating access and recognizing land rights of indigenous peoples, I would immediately mention the projects we've had. We currently have one in Nicaragua and the other one in my own home country, Bolivia, a decade ago, where large portions of the country have been demarcated and titled in the name of indigenous peoples. Another important example we've had, which we have not talked much about today, is the land redistribution aspect. Not the land administration, but land redistribution. And I would argue that the project we had in Brazil over a decade is probably the most successful the bank has supported. And there the issue of political economy was very important. As some of you may know, Brazil has a very large social movement called the landless movement, which was very opposed to this project on the grounds that it was unconstitutional because it was redistributing, it was doing land reform, which was not through the colonization and agrarian reform entity, which of course is perfectly constitutional because people can transact without necessarily going through that institute. And it became such a polarized issue that the way that the project not only survived but thrived in terms of support is by incorporating the participation of the labor unions in rural areas. So the National Confederation of Rural Workers, which represents more than 20 million people, was a major ally in supporting the project. So when there was a political economic conflict within Brazil, they were the first ones to come out and defend it because it benefited their constituents. Similar issues we can talk from the standpoint of institutional political economy. Namely, the case of Macedonia is one of the most successful projects we've had. It's a very small country. It's very tiny. It's only 1.7 million people. It was very successful because there was an institutional imperative as part of the desire to be part of the European Union and being surrounded in a neighborhood where they wanted to show that they were able to manage their not general administration, but public institutions much more efficiently, became an example for the world to see. Similar examples have happened in Russia, of all places, where you have one of the most sophisticated land administration systems, where you have one-stop shop where you can do basically all kinds of transactions with individuals or entities and recognition of rights. And again, that was an issue of the ability of the central government to decentralize some of the functions and transfer some of the access to information through various institutions. So there are plenty of examples, and I'll be happy to share with more from across the world where we have seen important successes. One in Africa, I would mention, for example, Malawi in terms of land redistribution. And some of these have also been reviewed by IEG, and of course all the ICRs are available. Back to you, Enrique.
Thank you. Sure, Mark.
Just one additional point, I think, this is working, that I think the bank group underutilizes our convening power, and in the sense of combined with less than our full capacity to be imaginative and thinking about how we influence the political economy by assembling constituencies that in a sort of, let's call it, pre-competitive space, even though there may be a legacy of land conflict, and bringing together companies, not just internationals, but also locals where most of the land grabbing occurs, and NGOs. Okay, so the operational NGOs, we're doing some interesting work in that along those lines in Mozambique with a project, but I'm talking about kind of in a pre-competitive space where you bring folks together, probably initially without the government in the room, to talk about challenges, shared challenges, and the need for solutions, and start to develop a consensus which then can influence government later on.
Thank you. Let me add to these issues of political economy and how do we design projects differently right now. Many years ago, for example, as part of a landscape approach, you also have protected area that play a very important role in the provision of ecosystem services and in the landscape. So maybe 20 years ago, we would have designed a project including protected area without really thinking about the land rights of the indigenous people that own the forest. And we would have designed the protected area and think about, well, you know, if people need to be resettled, they will be resettled, and applying our safeguard policy, but not much more. What I see more and more from my position in the environment, global practice is that even protected area projects right now in Latin America, in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, we are trying, because of the recognitions of the land rights issues, we are trying, for example, to design protected areas so that we don't have a community in there. So you design the border of your protected area to leave at least the community outside. Still, the community are impacted because maybe they don't have the same. They will have certain limitations in what they can collect from the forest, etc., etc. But I think that all these movements, all this discussion, it is definitely paying off in the way we design projects, also from the environment point of view. And the other point I wanted to mention, which is related to one of the questions, is the customary rights. Somebody wrote, we need more recognition from the African government that there are customary land rights. And I just wanted to say that I think maybe we are not fast enough, but we are seeing that things are moving. And I want to take again the example of Liberia. When I started to work in Liberia 10 years ago, the obvious statement of any minister of forestry, which there is the Forest Development Authority, was, well, forest land belongs to the government. And they were saying, this is what is written in the law, and there was no real discussion about it. 10 years later, we went through major changes, and now there is in Parliament almost going to be approved a land rights law that really recognizes the rights to the land that belong to really the indigenous people. It took about 10 years. It's one of the most progressive laws in the world, to be honest. It's amazing the amount of power it gives back to the communities. And so I think that the more cases we have like Liberia that you can share, and the international level you can share in Africa, the more it becomes sort of contagious, if you want, and sets an example. We have a lot of these cases already in some countries in Latin America, as Jorge was mentioning, but I think that also in Africa we are moving in that direction.
Thank you.
So can I just jump in with a quick footnote? Klaus had talked about the doing business indicators. Another tool that is available, particularly with relevance to agriculture, is the Enabling the Business of Agriculture report, which is now going to be in its third year of publication. So they're going from 10 countries to 62 countries. They were looking at 6 topic areas, mostly around input, seeds, fertilizers, mechanization, and access to markets, etc. They will be adding land, and Klaus is sort of giving us intellectual guidance on that aspect also. Now, in terms of the inclusion of land aspects in the EBA report, I think that it's important that this be seen not as benchmarking in absolute terms, but in relative terms. So we are not going to be looking at the performance of these countries in absolute terms, but we do have a distance to frontier type of approach, which, again, will provoke action and reaction. Particularly from the mature governments. I was in Rwanda not too long ago, and we sort of had the stable with the traffic lights system across the various topic areas. And the Minister of Agriculture, she turned to me and she said, we are not doing so good on seeds, but we are already moving on it. So I think these reports, like doing business, I'm responding to a comment there whether the recommendations are too blunt. Yes, they are blunt, but the idea is to provoke discussion, debate, and some sort of action towards a deeper analysis of the issues, and then an appropriate response. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. I would like to go back to Beatrix and try to get the perspective from the country office, especially now that we are supposed to be even more global than before, and related to some of the questions from the audience in terms of access to global knowledge and experience for the counterparts and also for the people, colleagues in the country offices. What are the challenges and also how you see this going forward?
Thank you very much. I think the challenge we have experienced at the country level with respect to knowledge sharing, technical experience, has to do with people who are not, at least at the national level, people who have the capacity to do what they are expected to do, but are not motivated enough to do that. So the system does not allow them to do what they would otherwise have done, effectively. And that has been an issue. Within the land administration project, implementation is within the sector ministries. And staff from the ministries see this as an add-on activity beyond their normal work. And that becomes an issue when you want them to go a step further in terms of achieving project outcomes or implementing project activities. There has been a difference in terms of how we tackle this. We have had a number of hand-holding programs to let them understand the import of participating in project implementation, to let them understand the importance of effecting the change that we are all looking for. And that has made significant impact as far as sharing of knowledge is concerned. From within the bank, I think the challenge we have experienced at the country level is when it comes to review of terms of reference, for instance, getting the technical expertise, to review the terms of reference, to respond, quick enough to government has been a challenge. And we have been blamed for that. I don't know how we will address that as an institution, but some of these technical areas are, difficult, and we don't have enough staff to work on these particular, specific issues. And that, I think, is something that the bank, need to look at. Fortunately, we have practice manager here, and I think we'll throw the challenge to him, how we get enough technical expertise, to ensure that we are more responsive to government demands as far as technical issues from their side is concerned, so as to set a pace, to motivate them to do what they are expected to do. Of course, there are areas where we need to continue building capacity, there's no doubt, but we think that from Lab 1 through to the implementation of Lab 2, we've seen tremendous improvement in capacity for government, implementing agencies. And one example is the development of the current land policy, which is before Parliament. An attempt to get a consultant failed, and a committee was set within the project implementing agency to have people to actually do it. And it has been one of the success of the project. I think I want to just quickly mention that on the customary land rights issues. In Ghana, unlike, if I remember correctly, the Lao example, the Constitution actually guarantees customary land rights. So you have a situation where the chiefs, the traditional authorities are very powerful in their own rights in terms of, holding the land in trust for the people. And this has been factored into the new land bill, the changes that are coming, and we can see progression, in that angle, and that is very positive as far as, the institutional dynamics are concerned. You also have a situation where there are a number of linkages that were missed out under Lab 1 because of the confusion with respect to design, and now you have linkages between the customary land secretariats, which have been established as part of project implementation, and how they link up with the national system through what they call the client services access units that is supposed to operationalize the idea of the one-stop shop. So you see a lot of collaboration, between and among different aspects and institutions of the project. I think I want to mention the fact that in the current project, the Lab 2, starting from Lab 1, there has been a strong collaboration between the project and one main agriculture project that we have, that is the Ghana Commercial Agriculture Project. There's been tremendous relationship building, linkages, and the collaboration is fantastic, creating a platform of engagement across global practices. And I think these are important points, to note, so that we know that land administration projects in and of themselves, can achieve so much. But when we stretch the linkages and the coordination to other sectors, we are better off in terms of achieving expected outcomes. Probably one other point is the social inclusion dimension of land administration project. It has been, it was a challenge under Lab 1. Projects, implementation didn't factor, issues of land. There was a whole report done, but implementation never happened. But under Lab 2, this has been factored into, and we can see the changes where through sensitization, through, engagement, chiefs would have been the only people to be consulted on land issues, but through the gender application within the project, we see a situation where queen mothers who would never have sat at the same table with chiefs to discuss land matters have been engaged, and they have been part of the process to the extent that the new land bill has factored, gender issues into consideration. So a lot is being done. Of course, I agree with one of the questioners, those who asked the question on the screen, that it is difficult to put the stories together, the success stories together, but I think we are beginning to have a clearer view perspective of what the successes are, what the challenges are, and how we should be jointly addressing those challenges going forward.
Thank you. Well, we are unfortunately running out of time, but yeah.
Just on the second to answer to something that Beatrix mentioned, how to get to the field with, review of terms of reference, consultants, etc. I think we all need to work more on enhancing the role of the Global Solution Group. As you know, there are global solution group. One is for, let's say, I have one for landscape, but there is one for land and geospatial. And it's really, we are only global practice as much as not only we can bring example, but we can really, work as a global practice. So I think we should use it more, global solution group.
Thank you. We have a lot of interesting questions that we won't be able to answer, but I'm sure that we can follow up with the organizers of the event to try to answer them. But at the end, this is the final challenge is, where do we go from here? We have been discussing the issue of land administration projects and the trend of cross-sectoral issues. So basically, in closing, I will invite any of the panelists to give us his or her forecast of the future on how we're going to tackle all these issues. Particularly, Jorge mentioned that in Africa, based on the deep dive that was carried out, we saw that we have not done enough. We have not worked cross-sectorally enough. So, what's next? Anybody?
I don't have answers, but I do have questions. So, I think there is a vast amount of work to be done on all these areas. But as we move forward, we need to start thinking about the next generation of challenges, whether these are coming from the climate smart aspects of managing land, urbanization, rural transformation, the sort of bursting cities and metropolitans. I'm from India, and, you have Delhi, Calcutta, Bombay, which are larger than several countries put together. Then the issue around refugees and IDPs. There are 64 million people who are displaced, forcibly displaced, whether it's for economic or political or security reasons. I saw an interesting statistic which suggested that refugees live for about 17 years in one place, so, take it as with a grain of salt. But certainly, once they move out of their natural, of their usual place of residence, they do tend to stay for a long time in other areas. About 40% of refugees are now living in cities and not just in camps. So all these pose very important questions, 10 billion people, and, how many more harvests between now and 2050 to feed all those people. So these are questions to which, the good management, the effective management of land resources, the limited land resources that we have are fundamental. So I just wanted to put those things out there for everybody to mull over.
Thank you.
I would just simply say that these issues are not going away. If anything, they're getting bigger, so we need more resources from within the bank as well as globally to tackle them. They're not going to go away. They're going to get bigger, and unless we tackle them, a lot of other things are not going to fall into place, including displacement of people and other issues.
For me, I think from an operational perspective, it would be important that when we are preparing or supporting government to prepare projects, we take our time to look at the existing data. It's important that we get, at least some basics right. And that's the first point. The second point is that the time for preparation of projects needs to be looked at. There is no point rushing through project preparation only to have challenges, from the beginning of project implementation. And I think this is not just specific to the land administration project, but projects in general. The third point is that when during implementation we encounter challenges, we should be bold enough to, stand up to those challenges and come out with solutions to address those. In other words, if we have to restructure, let's take that decision early enough so that we can achieve the expected results for these projects. And I believe that if we are able to be candid, in our evaluation, keep an eye on M&E, we should be able to address a lot of the operational challenges that we encounter, not only at the country level, but, at other sector levels. Thank you.
Mark, IFC.
So I'm just going to say that the future, looking into the crystal ball, is that you're going to see much more organic, bottom-up drive for improvements in land governance, and I think that's going to come from private companies, and I think by no means least from newly empowered local communities that NGOs are going to align with and better inform them of what their rights are. So with that will come political pressure, which will come a push for change from the bottom instead of kind of trying to push the elephant uphill, so to speak.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. What I would say is just that I agree. I mean, these issues will be even more discussed and more there will be more pressure to resolve them. So my advice is just really consider the programmatic approach. Consider the fact that this is like a puzzle, and each piece of the puzzle fits the entire pictures. Do your land administration project side to side in big collaboration with the other pieces, because at the end of the day, what we all want is that the total is more than the sum of individual parts. And that's really the landscape approach in some sense.
Okay, I think there will be looking at urban land tenure issues will certainly be more important in the future. And that is where I think we can use a lot of advantages from what is already going on in municipal finance projects and other interventions. Second, I think build the local capacity to deal with the political economy issues at the ground level. And I think that is what Mark was saying. There's a lot coming up in terms of very innovative approaches. And I think the third one is really to use the whole spectrum of bank instruments, which includes DPLs and P4Rs. I think focusing only on projects in this day and age where capacity is much greater in many of our client countries, I think being a little bit more and see what is the bank's comparative advantage relative to that, what other donors are being able to do. Because I think there's a lot of interest even by other donors. And if we lead the pack and show them how to come in, I think we can do a lot with if we are smart. And we don't need a lot of more resources from our side.
Thank you very much. It's been a very, very valuable discussion. So I will request an applause for our panelists. And thank you to all of you who stayed until after 2 p.m. and are still awake. Thank you so much.